24 minutes past the hour, and breaking news right now, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz announcing he is dropping out of the 2026 governor's race. He told reporters he believes he would have won another term, but decided, quote, that he can't give a political campaign his all after what he described as an extraordinarily difficult year for the state. The governor has faced national criticism in recent months, including from President Trump, of course, over that massive Somali fraud scandal engulfing the state. That includes Medicaid and daycare fraud that has cost taxpayers millions of dollars. Walz set to speak around noon today. We'll track this breaking news for you this morning here at the live desk.
So I've decided to step out of this race, and I'll let others worry about the election while I focus on the work that's in front of me for the next year. I'm passing on this race with zero sadness and zero regret. I did not run for this job to have the job. I ran for the job to do the job. Minnesota faces enormous challenges this year, and I refuse to spend a single minute doing anything other than rising to meet this moment.
This morning, Democratic leaders are facing growing criticism as social media influencers dig into the massive fraud scandal in Minnesota. Over the weekend, a video posted by Nick Shirley investigating the fraud schemes gained tens of millions of views online.
Literally, if you drive around Minnesota, around Minneapolis, you will see daycare centers, autism centers. You will then see transportation companies that have snow piled up as if they haven't moved in months. And then you also go into buildings where there'll be 20 healthcare companies, 14 and 22, the video that I published on X and YouTube. So it is like a kindergartner could figure out that there's fraud going on.
Wow, the last and latest cases involve several daycare centers, which each received millions of dollars. Federal prosecutors say it could add up to $9 billion in fraud. The National News Desk, Christine Frizzell, is joining us in Washington. And Christine, some pretty shocking, remarkable stuff here.
Yeah, Taylor, and when you really break down these numbers, you kind of can see some trends. One of those trends is that these businesses have been getting more and more money each year. And whether it's a transportation company that doesn't actually transport anyone or a daycare center with no children, the common thread here is that no one seems to be overseeing this taxpayer money once it gets sent out.
This door is locked.
This facility is licensed for 40 children. 0 children. I've come by this place 100 times. I've never seen a child here.
A now viral video raising even more questions about widespread fraud in Minnesota.
This building received over $3 million. Hello, how are you? I would like to see if I could bring little Joey, my son little Joey here. Is there paperwork, or can I check out the daycare?
Conservative social media influencer Nick Shirley joining forces with a man named David, who's been investigating federally funded businesses in the Twin Cities, particularly daycare centers, dozens of which they say they visited and found not to be operating, despite receiving millions of dollars in taxpayer money.
So this is Quality Learning Center. I meant to say Quality Learning Center.
Don't open up!
They said they spelt learning wrong.
Don't open up!
How do you have ice here, ma'am? I'm literally a YouTuber.
The video, which has now been viewed more than 75 million times, prompting a response from FBI Director Kash Patel, who said already the FBI had surged personnel and investigative resources to Minnesota to dismantle large-scale fraud schemes exploiting federal programs. The latest spotlight follows months of examples coming to light, including Feeding Our Future, which claimed to be providing 40,000 meals a week to children. The Justice Department so far charging at least 78 people in that case, the majority members of the Somali community.
There's a reluctance on the part of government officials in Minnesota to actually deal with it when the warning signs arrive. They're concerned about, maybe being called racist or bigoted. Also, that diaspora, the Somali diaspora in Minneapolis, is a powerful political force.
There are some other political forces, though, including GOP Congressman Tom Emmer, who represents Minnesota, that are calling for more accountability from Governor Tim Walz. They say he allowed fraud to flourish in the state for years. Critics say he's being targeted because he's a Democrat. I'm Christine Frizzell for the National News Desk.
There has been swift reaction to new claims of fraud in Minnesota. This following a now viral video allegedly showing dozens of examples of federally funded businesses that don't do what they say they do. The National News Desk, Christine Frizzell, reports on new bold accusations after FBI Director Kash Patel says he's already surged resources to Minnesota. Posting on X, the FBI believes this is just the tip of a very large iceberg.
The Department of Homeland Security posting this video of agents, quote, going door to door at suspected fraud sites in Minnesota.
This door is locked.
Following this now viral video showing what appear to be empty daycare centers, mostly run by members of the Somali community, which receive millions of dollars in taxpayer money.
Are there children here today?
No.
More than a dozen healthcare companies listed in this building, raising major questions about if they're companies at all.
All of these businesses are literally the same type of business, providing the same service in the same building.
Alarm bells also sounding about companies connected to what Minnesota's Department of Human Services website calls non-emergency medical transportation to get people to and from non-emergency medical service appointments.
Nobody from the state of Minnesota ever cross-checks to see if any rides were ever actually provided. All they did was write the check.
Speaker of the House Mike Johnson calling the video jaw-dropping, announcing the House Oversight Committee has expanded its investigation, with partners in the Senate also promising action.
I'm chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. This will be a primary focus of ours, and unfortunately, particularly in Democrat-controlled states, they're not. They refuse those records. I've got subpoena power. I will use that subpoena power to obtain these records.
Well, it's amazing to me that a 23-year-old journalist, a YouTuber, who's now got over 80 million views on this thing, found more in a matter of hours than Tim Walz and Keith Ellison, our Attorney General, have found in 7 years.
The latest claims follow multiple others in the state, with more than $1 billion in reported fraud. The biggest case involved a group called Feeding Our Future, which received hundreds of millions of dollars to provide meals it never did. Minnesota fraud cases so far resulting in 92 people charged, 82 of whom are Somali Americans, according to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Governor Tim Walz responding earlier this month.
This is on my watch. I am accountable for this, and more importantly, I am the one that will fix it.
Finding a fix for fraud said to be a top priority when lawmakers return to Capitol Hill. I'm Christine Frizzell for the National News Desk.
We've been hearing the word billions thrown around when it comes to fraud in Minnesota's social services system. Let's go to Emma Withrow from the Fact Check team. To start off, Emma, separate what we know right now, what has been confirmed versus what is still under investigation.
Yeah, so what's been confirmed, the DOJ says that hundreds of millions of dollars were stolen through Minnesota programs that have already been charged. The biggest one to note is the Feeding Our Future pandemic meals case, which the DOJ has called the largest pandemic relief fraud scheme that they've seen in U.S. history. These fraudsters siphoned off around 250 million taxpayer dollars. So far, more than 90 people have been charged. At least 60 have been convicted. That's all according to federal prosecutors as well. And another important thing to note is Somali Americans make up 89% of the defendants that have been charged.
And the billions number, that suggests that this wasn't an isolated event. It may not have been, right?
Not at all. Yeah, federal prosecutors say that this definitely wasn't a one-off. The fraud really stretched from pandemic meal programs to Medicaid housing help and even autism therapy for kids. So it was involving these different programs that were billing the government for services that just never happened. The probe now covers 14 programs, and investigators say early signs point to systemic abuse that could really add up to billions of dollars. That's all still being worked out in court, though. And they've made a preliminary estimate on how much it is, like the dollar amount. It's not a final audit. They say that more than half of roughly $18 billion spent since 2018 across those programs was likely fraudulent, stolen funds.
And it's just astonishing, as you mentioned, this could go down in history with roots to the pandemic. Much more to come. Emma, thank you. Emma will join us in a few minutes to dig deeper into the widespread fraud authorities say stretches back years. Federal prosecutors are now estimating that around half of the $18 billion taxpayer dollars supposed to help those in need was most likely stolen in Minnesota. Let's go to Emma Withrow from the Fact Check team. And officials say that this fraud didn't, of course, just happen overnight. But what do they say enabled it to go on for so long without being stopped?
So according to state audits and federal prosecutors as well, this wasn't just, criminals being clever. This was more of a systems failure was the cause of all this. Minnesota's nonpartisan legislative auditor found that state agencies actually raised red flags early on, especially during the pandemic, but they just kept approving these payments anyways.
And speaking of red flags, if those were raised, what does the DOJ say enabled these payments?
So a few of the reasons that were cited by the OLA were fear of lawsuits, also accusations of racism, and then just getting bad press if the claims of fraud were denied by the people being accused. Federal prosecutors say that hesitation kind of created an environment where fraud started to scale up pretty fast. One of the U.S. attorneys called it industrial scale fraud, and that's all according to reporting from the New York Times and the AP.
All right, we'll see if there are any on top of that systems changes as these prosecutors are pointing to. Emma, thank you.
Thanks. Jody, where do investigations stand now? Because I know there are multiple investigations. FBI director said it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, I agree with Cash. You've got FBI, HIS, IRS, DOJ, small business. You've got everybody and their brother in there. But I've said from day one, Taylor, this should be a RICO investigation.
Yeah,
it's got all the elements involved, and that would send a powerful message. So we'll have to see where this plays out. But $9 billion. And just a quick compliment to Nick Shirley. If anybody has not seen his video with these daycares that are not working and just sucking money out of the community, it'll make your blood boil. So please watch that if you haven't seen it. He did a great job.
Yeah, and we've been talking about that and showing that parts of that video on the news here today and yesterday. This isn't going to be a quick thing to investigate, is it? I mean, it's going to take some time.
No, you've got to track the money down, and you've got to tie this network together. But if it's done right, this could have a huge effect. My fear, Taylor, is everybody's looking at Minnesota. I can't believe this is an isolated incident. I'm sure it's going on in other cities. So I think this is hopefully going to send a very strong message. You cannot steal $9 billion from American taxpayers.
And the Minnesota fraud investigation thickening tonight as more boots are on the ground across the state and federal funding now frozen. Let's go straight to Ryan Smith at the live desk with those new developments. Ryan?
Yeah, this has really rapidly developed over the last couple of days. New fraud fallout in Minnesota tonight. The Department of Health and Human Services just announcing a freeze on all child care payments to Minnesota. That shakes out to about $185 million in federal funding each year. Top White House officials now point to this now viral video here from last week by independent journalist Nick Shirley, claiming daycare centers operated by Somali residents have committed up to $100 million in fraud.
Intrepid journalists have made shocking and credible allegations of extensive fraud in Minnesota's child care programs. We believe the state of Minnesota has allowed scammers and fake daycares to siphon millions of taxpayer dollars over the past decade.
O'Neill there now demanding the state provide attendance records, licenses, complaints, and previous inspections or investigations. Governor Tim Walz now saying an audit looking into the alleged fraud is due out by the end of January. And in response tonight, he stated, quote, "This is Trump's long game. We've spent years cracking down on fraudsters. It's a serious issue, but this has been his plan all along. He's politicizing the issue to defund programs that help Minnesotans." Now, as for FBI and Director Kash Patel, he said his agency has actually been on the ground tracking Minnesota probes for months now, including 16 reported open cases since May of this year, investigating more than 30 different healthcare and home care providers accused of fraud.
As the fraud investigation expands in Minnesota, Somali-run child care facilities, restaurants, and retailers in Washington state are facing increased scrutiny and backlash.
As a Somali, as a small business provider, we're really scared. People are afraid.
We want to raise the awareness that the Somali communities are part of the fabric of Washington, that they contribute to the economy and the livelihood, the everyday livelihood of this great state.
So far, a Seattle station, Como, says it's not aware of any allegations of fraudulent daycares in Washington state. And that brings us to our question of the day. Should elected officials be held criminally responsible for fraud? Head to thenationaldesk.com to cast your vote. One social media influencer's video, now viewed more than 100 million times, is raising questions about Somali-run businesses and taxpayer dollars. We have team coverage. We talk with the head of a conservative watchdog group, Scott Walter, about when we could see accountability. But first, the National News Desk, Christine Frizzau, details the new action being taken by the White House.
A viral video bringing a national spotlight to taxpayer-funded daycare centers in Minnesota.
Leering Center, I meant to say Quality Learning Center.
Allegations they were collecting tax dollars but not actually operating, being met with pushback. One daycare center manager calling the video dishonest.
We're open Mondays through Thursdays, 2 to 10 p.m. He was here earlier. I don't see him right now. We're open. We've been open. We haven't closed. We've been open for eight and a half years now. We haven't closed once during that period.
State officials acknowledging some daycare centers had been shut down, but most named in the video had been recently visited and found to be in compliance. Still, the Department of Homeland Security this week sent agents to investigate alleged fraudulent businesses following an announcement from the Justice Department about multiple charges in a Minnesota fraud scheme linked to a publicly funded program designed to help those with autism. One woman charged had also been charged in an earlier fraud scheme with Feeding Our Future, described by the Biden Justice Department as the largest pandemic fraud scheme in the United States. Attorney General Pam Bondi also weighing in, posting that of the 98 individuals charged in recent months, 85 are of Somali descent. Minnesota Congressman Tom Emmer posting, Somali Americans who committed fraud should have their citizenship revoked and be deported. Also calling on Governor Tim Walz to resign.
Tim Walz and our former colleague, who's now our Attorney General, Keith Ellison, have looked the other way for 7 years and allowed billions of dollars of Minnesota taxpayer money to be built out of Minnesota.
Governor Walz for months has insisted he's been cracking down on the fraud. A spokesperson telling Fox News this week he has strengthened oversight, including launching investigations into these specific facilities, one of which was already closed. A few other things happening in response. Kelly Loeffler, the head of the Small Business Administration, or SBA, has said that they will be withholding funds from Minnesota while these claims are investigated. And here on Capitol Hill, multiple Republican lawmakers have already started new or expanded investigations into fraud in the state. We expect this will be front and center when lawmakers return to Washington next week.
No doubt about that. Christine, it seems like these fraud allegations have been going on for years. Why are we hearing so much about them now?
Yeah, well, Dee Dee, of course, that viral video from Nick Shirley framed the situation in a way to provoke outrage, and it's working. And that video, of course, was shared by Vice President J.D. Vance and Elon Musk. One of the most shocking things, though, that we're learning is more and more people found to be charged in multiple schemes, which prosecutors say tells them they thought they could get away with it, so they simply kept going.
All right, Christine Frizzell reporting tonight from the Capitol. Thank you. For more on this story, let's bring in President of Capitol Research Center, Scott Walter. And Scott, I know that you have testified to 8 committees in Congress and recently testified to DOJ this summer on your research on taxpayer-funded NGOs, which I know goes back years. Thank you for joining us. As Christine just mentioned, there are now growing calls for Governor Tim Walz to resign. I know that your team has provided in-depth data on mass oversight in the state of Minnesota alone. When do you think we will finally start to see some accountability?
Well, that's hard to say because, of course, the political apparatus in Minnesota has not had much issue with this until very recently, when it blew up into such a big story, thanks to people like you, that it could no longer be ignored.
The Attorney General says more than 90 people have been charged in this investigation since ICE has been on the ground. And as you know, rapid development by the day with this story. How do you follow this money trail to possible national and international criminal activity? What does that process even look like? Where do you even begin?
Well, it's not at all an easy thing. And of course, unfortunately, the best way to have that happen is for both the state and local law enforcement to take it seriously and for them to be cooperating with national law enforcement. But of course, in Minnesota, they are very much opposed to cooperating with national law enforcement.
Well, Governor Walz has said he had been working for years to strengthen oversight in the state, especially due to sanctuary protections. You talk about local and federal and how they intersect. Do you think that that made it easier for some businesses to essentially hide in plain sight?
Well, presumably, yes, because again, you know, the state and local folks, on the one hand, they're much more knowledgeable about what's going on the ground, right? There's not thousands and thousands of FBI agents just covering Minnesota. But on the other hand, the state and local folks need with trying to make international connections or national connections, they need national law enforcement. All this is supposed to be working together, but in many states, alas, it is not.
Well, we know that Minnesota ranks high when it comes to the number of charities. And though Minnesota, I mean, right now it's being scrutinized, the story doesn't stop here. I mean, there are charities all across the country. What message does the current investigation in Minnesota send to them and how they operate nationwide?
You know, the biggest principle that's involved here is not complicated, and I dare say 90% or more of all Americans would agree. If you get taxpayer dollars, you should be able to show that you are actually helping people with that. And it should be easy for the public to see whether you're helping. But unfortunately, there was very little transparency in Minnesota, which is why it took years for this finally to surface.
The FBI has said this is just the tip of a very large iceberg. To quote FBI Director Kash Patel, we will see what this investigation unfolds. President of Capital Research Center, Scott Walter, thank you for joining us on the National News Desk.
Now, moving forward, HHS is going to require Minnesota and other states to receive prior justification plus a receipt or photo evidence before authorizing a payment. Meantime, the Department of Homeland Security sent agents to Minneapolis as part of a probe into the alleged fraud. Now, so far, the DOJ has charged around 100 people in connection with this investigation. Now, we're going to keep tabs on this story today, all day at the Live Desk and online at thenationaldesk.com.
And meanwhile, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is now facing growing pressure to resign over this. A group of Minnesota Republicans called out his leadership during the fraud scandal. Minnesota State Senators Bill Leisky, Nathan Weissenberg, and State Reps Marge Fogelman, Drew Roach, and Mike Weiner wrote in a joint statement, quote, "The red flags were everywhere. Yet year after year, the fraud kept growing, and year after year, nothing changed. When a governor fails to do what he is required to do, when he watches a crisis spiral out of control and does nothing to stop it, that is nonfeasance. The governor had a duty to oversee his administration and to protect these programs. He failed," end quote. Lawmakers are also saying that whistleblowers have told them the Walz administration tried to keep quiet concerns about the fraud.
We have dozens of credible whistleblower reports saying that exact same thing, that people were told not to say anything because they'd be called racist or Islamophobic or it would hurt the state. And so people tried to come forward but were shut down. And that protection of a particular community is what really allowed this fraud to flourish in Minnesota for years. But we have said very publicly that, yes, the bulk of the fraud we've discovered so far is in the Somali community, but some of our best whistleblowers are also in the Somali community. And it's really important that we get to the truth of this issue.
We are also learning new information about one of the daycares that got the most attention in that viral video from YouTuber Nick Shirley. The Quality Learning Center in Minneapolis, which even misspelled the word learning on its sign, has been cited for 121 violations by state inspectors over the past 4 years. According to state licensing records reviewed by the Daily Wire, the center was flagged for supervision failures, unsafe conditions for toddlers, missing records, and repeated safety issues. Despite those violations, the center remains licensed and has received millions in state funding. And now House Majority Whip and Minnesota Congressman Tom Emmer says he wants to deport every Somali guilty of fraud in the U.S. Emmer wrote this, quote, "Our nation will not tolerate those who take advantage of our charity and refuse to assimilate into our culture." Additionally, if any naturalized Somalis had undisclosed ties to terrorist organizations like al-Shabaab, I want to see their citizenship revoked.
From a federal funding full stop to congressional hearings, the massive Minnesota fraud investigation is taking on legs tonight.
The Department of Justice, as we speak, is continuing to execute search warrants and subpoenas. People will be in handcuffs as a result of the fraud that Governor Walz has allowed to occur.
We begin with team coverage tonight. Christine Frizzell breaks down new aggressive actions taken by the White House against the state of Minnesota. But first, we go to Emma Withrow at the Live Desk with the new calls for accountability on Capitol Hill. What are you hearing, Emma?
Yeah, Dee Dee, Republican House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comey
Comer announcing 2 new hearings to investigate fraud allegations in Minnesota as we take a live look over Minneapolis tonight. So one next week with the Minnesota state representatives, and then another one in February where Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison have been asked to testify. So that's going to be a whole other thing. The national spotlight continues to shine on Minneapolis and daycare facilities run by Somali immigrants in the wake of these massive fraud and allegations and investigations. Brand new video tonight, though, showing ICE agents patrolling across Minnesota, checking in with local business owners. The FBI says it's already surged resources to Minnesota amid political and community unrest after several Somali migrants were arrested on fraud charges. President Trump writing on his Truth Social platform that, quote, much of the Minnesota fraud, up to 90%, is caused by people that came into our country illegally from Somalia.
The Department of Homeland Security is conducting door-to-door investigations on the ground at potential fraud sites, and they're also, of course, conducting continued deportations of illegal aliens in Minnesota's communities. We're also not afraid to use denaturalization. That's a tool at the President and the Secretary of State's disposal, and it's one this administration has previously used before.
Widespread fraud claims in Minnesota are now prompting new inspections in other states. As the National News Desk Lisa Rentala reports, one Ohio lawmaker is calling out reports of fraud within publicly funded daycares in Columbus.
From Minnesota,
I meant to say Quality Learning Center. They spelled learning wrong.
To Columbus.
You can see that this place is just a total dump.
More people are targeting Somali-owned daycares, looking for kids and suggesting fraud.
Would you call these video clips allegations, or would you call them proof of fraud?
That's just an allegation of fraud.
Now State Rep Josh Williams, who is running for U.S. Congress, sent this letter to the Ohio Department of Children and Youth, calling for more unannounced inspections and attendance audits of all publicly funded daycares in Ohio. He also wants to pull state and federal funds on the suspicion of fraud, opposed to a charge or conviction.
We're saying the funds have to stop until you prove that it is not fraud moving forward.
I mean, you go through some of these inspection reports and you do see non-compliance when it comes to attendance. Could that be a suspicion of fraud?
Yes, that can be a basis of suspicion of fraud.
Of the 578 publicly funded daycares in Franklin County, I looked through inspection reports for the first 20. Here's what I found. More than half was subject to a state inspection within the last 3 months. More than half were also found to be non-compliant with enrollment records. 2 were non-compliant with attendance records, which is used to calculate public funds.
With this letter that was sent yesterday, are you suggesting there is widespread fraud within publicly funded daycare centers in Columbus, especially those Somali-owned?
What we're alleging is that there is widespread reporting of potential fraud from individuals on the ground.
If fraud is found, Representative Williams says operators who are legal residents should face increased penalties. He says non-legal residents should be deported. At least one congressman in Minnesota is suggesting stripping citizenship.
And Representative Williams told our station in Columbus, Ohio, WSYX, the state has adjusted attendance procedures to prevent daycare operators from obtaining a child's individual PIN code and enter it into their system when a child is not there. In those reports, 7,500 Ohio families received new PIN numbers. And continuing coverage, the fraud allegations in Minnesota are also prompting calls for extra scrutiny of the taxpayer money given to daycares in Washington state. Jim Walz, chair of the state's Republican Party, says a closer look is a no-brainer.
That's the first and the most important question. Are these daycares really providing daycare services, child care to children, or are they illusory?
Our Seattle station, Como, reached out to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which said it reviews all grant applications to ensure eligibility and requires that receipts are kept and provided when requested. And in Utah, Governor Spencer Cox says the state is launching a full review of its child care assistance safeguards. Governor Cox noting that Utah's system is significantly different from Minnesota's. And continuing our team coverage on the White House's new aggressive approach against the state of Minnesota Minnesota over alleged fraud. As the National News Desk, Christine Frizzell reports, the governor says it's all part of President Trump's strategy to cut services to those in need.
The Trump administration ending 2025 in a similar way to how it started the year, making major cuts to funding, at least temporarily, across the state of Minnesota. As investigations into rampant fraud are carried out, a top official with the Department of Health and Human Services announced all child care payments to the state would be frozen. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz slamming the move, accusing President Trump of politicizing the issue to defund programs that help Minnesotans. HHS, though, taking it even further, announcing new rules for the entire country.
Starting today, we require a justification, receipt, or photo evidence before we make a payment.
The Justice Department executing search warrants and subpoenas. The Department of Labor investigating the unemployment insurance program. The U.S. Department of Agriculture continuing its pursuit of names and addresses of those who receive SNAP benefits. And the Department of Homeland Security now has hundreds of agents on the ground conducting door-to-door investigations.
One thing now the Homeland Security investigation special agents are looking into is just that you said, that money trail, where this money is going to foreign aid. Obviously looking at any type of links to any criminal activity, obviously terrorism activity.
The Department of Treasury announced 4 weeks ago it was investigating whether any of the money received had been sent to the Somali terror group Al-Shabaab. As questions mount over taxpayer-funded businesses, including daycare centers, accused in this viral video of receiving millions, but not actually operating.
All right, we've arrived to ABC Learning Center.
One of the daycare centers featured says kids were inside the day Nick Shirley came, but he was not allowed in because he was in a large group of people in masks. Sharing this surveillance video with local affiliate WCCO.
According to the timestamps in the videos, this woman takes a young child into the center at around 9 a.m. that day. About 3 hours before Shirley arrives.
I'm Christine Frizzell for the National News Desk.
And members of Minnesota's congressional delegation issued a formal letter to Governor Tim Walz demanding accountability for the statewide fraud crisis. They want to know if Walz will cooperate with the federal and the House Oversight Committee investigation and recuse himself from state investigations. Writing, quote, all told, leading government prosecutors now fear that the scale of taxpayer fraud in Minnesota exceeds over $9 billion in stolen funding. Not only will this be the largest fraud scandal in the U.S. history, but it will also contribute to the nearly $40 trillion in debt facing our nation. Minnesota Congressman Pete Stauber signed the letter and posted, quote, the scale of the fraud makes it impossible for Walz to oversee a fair and honest investigation. And lawmakers outside of Minnesota and the Trump administration are also calling out Governor Walz for the fraud that happened under his watch. President Trump posted on Truth Social, quote, there is more fraud in California than there is in Minnesota, if that's even possible. When you add in election fraud, then they are tied for first. 2 crooked governors, 2 crooked states.
This is a top priority for the administration. The Department of Justice, as we speak, is continuing to execute search warrants and subpoenas. People will be in handcuffs as a result of the fraud that Governor Walz has allowed to occur for many, many years.
We're borrowing $1 trillion a year that we don't have, and we shouldn't be giving that money to foreigners. We've focused for years on illegal immigrants and the damage they do to the country, but the fact of the matter is these aren't the legal immigrants of 100 years ago who came to America for freedom and opportunity. Now we're faced with immigrants like these folks from Somalia who just came here to see how much free stuff they can get, whether it's legal or scam. I think we need to cut off all welfare for all immigrants, Americans only.
The Trump administration also paused funding for all child care services in Minnesota until recipients can verify their identity.
Staying on top of the ongoing investigation in Minnesota over fraud claims, the Small Business Administration says it's suspending nearly 7,000 Minnesota borrowers after uncovering suspected fraud. The agency is reviewing thousands of loans tied to the Paycheck Protection Program and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. These loans were approved by the state for a total of $400 million. The head of the SBA, Kelly Loeffler, that lady right there, released a statement reading, "These individuals will be banned from all SBA loan programs, including disaster loans, going forward. We will also refer every case where appropriate to federal law enforcement for prosecution and also repayment." Republicans on Capitol Hill, though, are going louder for their calls for some sort of accountability. You have one Florida representative is claiming the fraud reaches levels of organized crime and compared what's going on in Minnesota to mafia levels. Right now, the SBA is pausing about $5.5 million of this funding pending further review. So far, prosecutors have charged nearly 100 people in connection with this case.
Wow, Angela, thank you. Well, new revelations about donations from Somali-run daycares to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Walz received nearly $10,000 in campaign contributions from Democratic supporters connected to Somali-operated daycares. The Washington Examiner reports, quote, like the Somali-run child care facilities highlighted by videographer Nick Shirley, these companies appear as legitimate businesses on paper, but upon closer inspection, some appear not to be operational. The Trump administration has announced a freeze on child care funding to all states following allegations of fraud against daycares in Minnesota. This announcement comes as a Washington state lawmaker calls for an independent audit of child care centers that receive taxpayer money. The National News Desk Chris Daniels has been pressing state leaders for answers about if or when they'll investigate.
Just days away from the start of the next legislative session, Travis Couture says oversight is needed.
We should have more open and transparent government.
The House Assistant Minority Floor Leader and Allen Republican says the viral social media videos depicting potential fraud at Somali-run child care centers is why the state should create a third-party audit of private entities receiving public money.
Make sure that the taxpayer money is being used appropriately.
It comes after both Washington's governor and attorney general acknowledged receiving both fraud and harassment complaints at Somali-run facilities in recent days, but do not have a specific number to provide. With a long-standing policy of not answering questions about potential investigatory matters, adding the State Department of Social and Health Services normally handles fraud allegations against child care providers. The AG's office uniquely handles both defending state agencies and investigating fraud, but says if there were a potential conflict of interest, the office would ensure a separation of functions.
Are you aware of anything in terms of an actual case of fraud, of the use of taxpayer funds at any of these child care centers?
I'm not aware of any of this, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that exists.
Imran Siddiqui, the executive director of Washington's Council on American Islamic Relations, says the viral videos in both Minnesota and Washington depicting subsidized child care centers with no kids could be misleading.
And one of the things that I would say is my kids have been out of school for the past 2.5 weeks. And people are showing up at the door of a school that they're researching on December 31st. So how do you know that these businesses are even open during this time?
We need to investigate these allegations of fraud.
Couture says the entire story is why his House Bill 2058 is needed to change the system and provide an outside voice to determine what's in the best interests of taxpayers.
The state government has to be proactive in looking into any kind of fraudulent activity.
That was Chris Daniels reporting for us. Representative Couture believes his bill will get a hearing when the Washington State House session begins next month.
New tonight, the National News Desk is learning more about potentially more fraud stemming from the state of Minnesota. As our Taylor Murray reports, this time it's over suspected fraudulent activity regarding COVID-era lending programs.
A sweeping federal fraud investigation into pandemic-era relief programs has escalated in Minnesota. The U.S. Small Business Administration has now moved to suspend thousands of borrowers tied to suspected abuse of COVID-19 aid. After reviewing thousands of Paycheck Protection Program and economic injury disaster loan approvals issued during the pandemic, the SBA has moved to suspend 6,900 Minnesota borrowers for this suspected fraudulent activity. According to Small Business Administration Administrator Kelly Loeffler, these borrowers were collectively approved for about 7,900 loans. And according to her post on X, these loans totaled roughly $400 million.
This looks like a complex scheme that was set up to defraud taxpayers, our federal government, of needed funds that would have gone out during COVID for hungry families, for children, for small businesses.
The Small Business Administration will now pause annual funding to Minnesota. In a letter to Governor Tim Walz, SBA says over $5.5 million in federal annual support will be halted for concerns about oversight failures. The borrowers implicated in the suspected pandemic-era fraud are also banned from all future SBA loan programs, including disaster assistance, effective immediately. And cases will also be referred to federal law enforcement for potential prosecution and repayment. President Trump recently criticized pandemic-era spending and oversight, saying this on New Year's Eve.
I view that as a reason for a good year because we're going to get to the bottom and we're going to get that money back. It's all coming back.
The SBA's actions come amid a broader federal effort to pursue cases tied to pandemic-era relief fraud. Multiple federal agencies, including the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, have announced investigations into related schemes in Minnesota. I'm Taylor Murray with the National News Desk.
And let's take a look back now. The history of these crimes and what we're learning now that is just the tip of the iceberg in schemes that go back a decade. Court documents from a 2015 case targeting the Children's Choice Center describe in depth how state prosecutors discovered the fraud and provide numbers on how many children were observed coming in versus what was being charged to the state. In order for these schemes to work, daycare centers needed to sign up low-income families that qualify for child care assistance funding. Surveillance video from the 2015 case prosecuted by Hennepin County show parents checking their kids into a center only to leave with them a few minutes later. Sometimes no kids would show up, but the center would bill the state for a full day of child care. This specific child care center was prosecuted, found guilty, fined, and paid restitution. And now that's just one example, but years later, we're learning more about how deep and lucrative several of these potential fraud cases have become.
And on that note, we take you out live to Seattle, Washington tonight, where State Representative Jim Walsh is now calling for an immediate review and audit of state child care facilities. He says he believes state funds are being misused at government-subsidized child care facilities. Walsh goes on to add that after revelations of potential fraud in Minnesota, all he wants to see is more state transparency.
This is significant money. Put it all together, and it's getting into the billions. It's a lot of money that the state of Washington is paying child care providers with not enough accountability.
Walsh here stressing that one always has to be aware of the greater context, and he's not aware at this time of any criminal investigation tied to state-subsidized facilities. However, he says he's seen enough to encourage the Attorney General to take a harder line when looking for fraud. Attorney General Nick Brown's office acknowledging that formal complaints have been filed, responding in a statement here tonight, writing in quote part, "We and other entities are receiving harassment complaints and fraud complaints. We are in the process of going through them and do not have a specific number to provide."
We also expect to learn much more about the rampant fraud in Minnesota when congressional lawmakers plan to grill state officials. Both Governor Tim Walz and State Attorney General Keith Ellison have been asked to testify before the House Oversight Committee in February. The National News Desk's Christine Frizzell joining us now live from Capitol Hill with more on this. Good morning to you, Christine.
Good morning, Jan. You know, we've been hearing for months about this fraud in Minnesota, but of course that recent video from conservative social media influencer Nick Shirley really raised a lot more questions about if dozens of businesses, including daycares, are receiving taxpayer money but not operating. The Trump administration, you'll recall, acted swiftly, cutting off all daycare funds to the state, requiring a justification and a receipt or photo evidence before the money will be sent. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer announced 2 hearings on the matter, one next month, as you mentioned, in which Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison have been invited to testify. By the way, we are learning this morning Governor Walz will be holding a press conference today to discuss his future. Some have speculated he'll actually be dropping out of the governor's race. But we do have a hearing here on Capitol Hill this week where people directly involved in overseeing these federally funded businesses have been asked to answer what may be some tough questions.
Minnesota. So I'm pretty confident they're going to be here Wednesday. We're going to have our first committee hearing. We're bringing state officials in. They're going to be bringing with them more evidence. The reason we need to present this evidence publicly on a national level is to help the Department of Justice obtain more warrants to go in. We're getting reports that many of these daycares are changing their names and they're having break-ins and mysteriously losing their files.
The majority of the daycares being investigated here are run by Somali Americans. This investigation follows what's referred to as the largest incident of COVID fraud in our country, the Feeding Our Future scandal. The vast majority of those charged in that were also members of the Somali community in Minnesota. I'm Christine Frizzell for the National News Desk.